Barron Trump destroys liberal journalist who tried to harass his mother, Melania. I dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of January. Subscribe and help make my dream come true. God bless you. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the sleek Manhattan building that housed the headquarters of a major news network. Inside, a liberal journalist, Rebecca Blake, paced the studio floor. She was preparing for an exclusive interview with former First Lady Melania Trump. Rebecca's reputation for hard-hitting questions and calculated ambushes had earned her both acclaim and notoriety, and she saw this interview as her chance to make headlines. Meanwhile, across the city, Barron Trump stood at the door of his family's penthouse, adjusting the collar of his blazer. Now a poised young man in his late teens, he had grown into his role as a protective son. As his mother prepared for the interview, he couldn't shake the feeling that the journalist's intentions were far from genuine. Barron had seen enough headlines to recognize Rebecca's pattern of veiled hostility. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" he asked, his voice steady but concerned. Melania smiled softly. "Yes, Barron. It's important to speak for myself, no matter what they say." The ride to the studio was uneventful, but the tension was palpable. Melania's serene demeanor masked the inner steel she had developed over years in the public eye. Barron, sitting beside her, scrolled through Rebecca's recent articles on his phone, noting the subtle jabs and thinly veiled criticisms. He felt his protective instincts flare, but he knew his mother had chosen this path deliberately. When they arrived at the studio, cameras clicked and reporters swarmed. Melania moved with the grace of someone accustomed to scrutiny, while Barron walked just behind her, a silent sentinel. Rebecca greeted them with a broad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Trump, Barron, welcome," she said smoothly. "Shall we get started?" As they entered the interview set, Barron's unease deepened. The lighting was harsh, the setup intimidating. He took a seat just out of frame, his sharp eyes watching every movement. The stage was set, but Barron could feel the undercurrents of Rebecca's agenda. He knew this would be more than just an interview. It would be a test of resilience for both his mother and himself. The lights dimmed slightly as the cameras rolled, casting a spotlight on Melania Trump. She sat poised, her hands folded neatly on her lap, exuding a quiet confidence. Across from her, Rebecca Blake leaned forward with a practiced smile, her pen poised over a notepad. Barron watched from the sidelines, his expression neutral, but his mind alert, anticipating every subtle jab that might come his mother's way. Rebecca began with pleasantries, her voice warm and inviting. "Mrs. Trump, thank you for joining us today. It's been a while since we've heard your perspective." Melania nodded gracefully. "Thank you for having me. I believe it's important to share my thoughts directly, not through assumptions." The opening questions were mild, focusing on Melania's initiatives during her time as First Lady and her transition to private life. Rebecca's tone was polite, but Barron could see the cracks forming. Her follow-up questions grew sharper, subtly hinting at controversy surrounding the Trump family. "Do you feel," Rebecca asked, her voice laced with faux concern, "that your Be Best campaign was overshadowed by your husband's divisive rhetoric?" Melania paused for a moment, her calm unbroken. "I believe my work speaks for itself," she replied evenly. "The focus was always on the well-being of children, and I am proud of what we accomplished." Barron shifted in his seat, sensing Rebecca's frustration at not eliciting a defensive reaction. The journalist pressed further, her tone becoming less subtle. "But surely," Rebecca continued, "there were moments where you disagreed with your husband's approach. How did you reconcile that as a role model for women?" Melania's gaze remained steady, but Barron noticed a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "Every family has disagreements," she said carefully. "What matters is finding common ground and standing by your principles. That is what I have always done." Rebecca leaned back slightly, her lips curving into a faint smirk. "Some might say," she began, "that your silence during key moments was perceived as complicity. How do you respond to those critics?" Before Melania could answer, Barron's voice cut through the room, calm but firm. "With respect, Ms. Blake, are we here to discuss my mother's accomplishments or to make assumptions about her character?" All eyes turned to him, the camera operators momentarily frozen. Barron's tone was measured, But there was no mistaking the protective fire in his words. Rebecca hesitated, caught off guard by the interruption. Melania glanced at her son, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Barron," she said softly, "thank you." Turning back to Rebecca, she added, "I believe my son raises a fair point. Shall we focus on the purpose of this interview?" Rebecca forced a laugh, her composure momentarily shaken. "Of course," she said, her tone tightening. But the dynamic in the room had shifted, and Barron's interjection had set the stage for what would come next. Rebecca regained her composure quickly, her smile returning, though it carried a sharper edge now. "You're right, Mrs. Trump," she said smoothly. "Let's shift focus." Barron remained seated off-camera, his gaze locked on Rebecca, his instincts on high alert. He could tell the journalist was recalibrating, preparing for her next move. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice adopting a tone of faux sincerity. "Let's talk about legacy, Mrs. Trump. As a mother and former First Lady, what do you hope people will remember about your time in the White House?" It seemed innocuous, but Barron recognized it as the bait for a larger trap. His mother, ever composed, responded thoughtfully. "My hope is that people will remember my commitment to children's well-being and the importance of kindness." "Be Best" was not just a slogan. It was a call to action for everyone to focus on the next generation, Melania said, her voice steady and sincere. Rebecca nodded, her pen tapping rhythmically against her notepad. "That's admirable," she said. Then, with calculated precision, she added, "But do you think that message might have been undermined by some of the more controversial aspects of your family's time in office?" Barron stiffened in his seat, recognizing the pivot to sensationalism. Melania, however, remained unfazed. "Every administration faces challenges," she replied. "My focus has always been on the positive impact we can have, not on the distractions." Rebecca's smile tightened, sensing she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted. "And yet," she pressed, "there were moments when critics argued that your silence on certain issues spoke louder than words." For example, before she could finish, Barron's voice cut through the tension once more, calm yet unyielding. "Miss Blake, I believe this interview was intended to discuss my mother's work, not to rehash criticisms that have been addressed countless times." The entire room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Rebecca turned toward him, her expression a mixture of surprise and irritation. "Barron," she said, forcing a smile, "I understand your desire to protect your mother, but these are valid questions." Barron stood, his tall frame towering over the seated journalist. "Valid questions are one thing," he said, his voice measured but firm. "Ambushes disguised as interviews are another. If your goal is to provoke rather than inform, you're doing a disservice to journalism and to your audience." Melania turned to her son, a look of quiet pride in her eyes. Rebecca, caught off guard, fumbled for a response. "I'm simply doing my job," she said defensively. "And my job," Barron replied, his voice unwavering, "is to ensure my mother's voice is heard, not distorted." The gravity of his words hung in the air, leaving Rebecca momentarily speechless. Barron returned to his seat, his gaze never leaving the journalist. Rebecca forced a smile, her confidence visibly shaken. "Very well," she said, her tone icy. "Let's proceed." But the atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. Barron's interjection had not only disarmed Rebecca, but also set a precedent for the remainder of the interview. The tension in the room was palpable as Rebecca adjusted her posture, her composed facade cracking ever so slightly. She was determined to regain control of the narrative, her tone now more pointed than polished. "Mrs. Trump," she began, her words carefully chosen, "while your accomplishments as First Lady are commendable, some argue that your initiatives were overshadowed by controversies surrounding your family. How do you reconcile that?" Melania maintained her calm, her serene expression betraying none of the frustration she might have felt. "Every public figure faces scrutiny," she said, her voice steady. "My focus has always been on contributing positively, regardless of distractions or criticism. I believe the work speaks for itself." Rebecca leaned forward, her smile sharpening. "But surely there must have been moments when you questioned the impact of your silence. when the public needed to hear from you on divisive issues. Her voice was laced with faux concern, but her intent was unmistakable. Barron's jaw tightened, his sharp eyes studying Rebecca's every move. He knew this wasn't an attempt to seek understanding. It was an attempt to provoke, and he wasn't about to let it slide. "Ms. Blake," he interjected, his tone calm but firm, "it's interesting how you frame my mother's silence as complicity, yet you ignore the depth of her work. Isn't that a convenient narrative for someone looking to sensationalize rather than inform?" Rebecca froze for a fraction of a second before turning to Barron with a strained smile. "I'm merely exploring the questions people have," she said, attempting to regain her footing. "Then perhaps you should explore them fully," Barron countered, his words measured. "Ask about the countless hours my mother spent on initiatives to support children. Ask about the partnerships she formed to combat bullying and promote mental health. That's the full picture, isn't it?" A murmur rippled through the room. Even the crew, who had remained professionally detached, couldn't help but glance at one another, sensing the shift in power dynamics. Rebecca's confidence faltered, but she pressed on, unwilling to concede. "Of course, those contributions are significant," she said, her tone clipped. "But the public is entitled to know how those efforts fit into the larger context." Melania placed a gentle hand on Barron's arm, signaling for him to let her speak. "Ms. Blake," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "context is important, which is why I am here, to provide it myself. I trust my work and my values to speak louder than assumptions or controversies. If that is not the story you wish to tell, then perhaps this is not the platform for my voice." Rebecca blinked, clearly unprepared for such a direct rebuttal. She attempted to pivot, her words hurried. "Of course, Mrs. Trump. Let's move on." But the damage was done. The control she had sought to wield had slipped away, and the balance of the interview now rested firmly in Melania and Barron's hands. As the cameras rolled on, Rebecca's attempts to salvage the conversation felt forced, her questions losing their edge. Barron sat back, his confidence unwavering. He had defended his mother not with anger, but with reason, and in doing so, he had not only protected her, but redefined the narrative Rebecca had sought to construct. The air in the studio had shifted. Rebecca Blake, once commanding the conversation, now found herself grasping for control. Her questions lacked the sting they carried earlier, and the deliberate rhythm of her words betrayed her unease. Across from her, Melania Trump exuded grace and calm, while Barron sat in quiet observation, ready to step in if needed. The dynamic had changed, and Rebecca knew it. "Mrs. Trump," Rebecca said, forcing a smile, "let's talk about the future. What are your plans now that your time in the White House is behind you? Will you continue to advocate for children's issues?" Melania smiled softly. "Absolutely. The well-being of children remains my priority. I am working on several initiatives focused on education and mental health, and I look forward to collaborating with organizations that share these goals." Rebecca nodded, though her expression remained tense. "That's admirable," she said. Then, in an attempt to regain her footing, she added, "But do you believe the public will embrace your efforts, considering the controversies that continue to follow your family?" Barron leaned forward, his voice cutting through the room before his mother could respond. "Ms. Blake, let's address the heart of your question. Are you asking about the initiatives themselves, or about your perception of their reception? Because it seems to me that you're more interested in framing the story around controversy than celebrating the impact of the work." Rebecca stiffened, her smile faltering. "I'm simply reflecting public sentiment," she replied, her tone defensive. "Public sentiment," Barron echoed, his voice steady. "Or the narrative you choose to highlight. Because there's a difference, and it's worth being honest about which one you're pursuing." A murmur rippled through the room as Barron's words landed. The production crew exchanged glances, sensing the tension mounting again. Rebecca shifted in her seat, her polished veneer cracking under the weight of the moment. Melania took the opportunity to redirect. "The work I do is not about public sentiment," she said firmly. "It's about making a difference. I cannot control what people choose to focus on, but I can control my actions and my dedication to the causes I believe in." Rebecca forced a laugh, attempting to deflect. "Well, it seems you have a strong support system in your son," she said, her tone tinged with condescension. Barron, you've been quite vocal today. Do you often speak on your mother's behalf? Barron's expression remained calm, but his words carried a quiet strength. I don't need to speak on her behalf, he said. Her actions speak for themselves. But when her integrity is questioned unfairly, I won't hesitate to stand up for her. That's what family does. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca glanced at her notepad, but the usual sharpness of her demeanor was gone. The conversation had taken a turn she hadn't anticipated, and it was clear to everyone in the room that the control she once wielded had slipped through her fingers. As the cameras continued to roll, Rebecca attempted to steer the interview back to safer ground, but the damage had been done. Barron and Melania had turned the tables, transforming what had been intended as an ambush into a showcase of resilience, dignity, and strength. The interview's momentum had shifted entirely. Rebecca's carefully crafted plan to catch Melania Trump off guard had unraveled, leaving her struggling to maintain composure. Meanwhile, Melania's serene confidence and Barron's quiet but powerful interjections had not only deflected the attacks, but reframed the conversation entirely. The audience, both in the studio and those watching live, could feel the change. Rebecca cleared her throat, glancing down at her notepad as if searching for a lifeline. Mrs. Trump, she began, her voice more measured. It's clear that your family's legacy continues to evoke strong opinions. How do you respond to those who believe your efforts are overshadowed by the political landscape your husband created? Melania paused, allowing a beat of silence to settle before she answered. Every individual is entitled to their opinion, she said gracefully. But my work is not about politics, it's about people. Children, families, and communities. That has always been my focus, and it will remain so. Rebecca tried to press further. But surely, she said, you must see how your association with certain policies affects the perception of your initiatives. Isn't it difficult to separate the two? This time, Barron leaned forward, his tone calm but resolute. Ms. Blake, he said, my mother's work stands on its own. You can question, analyze, and critique as much as you like, but the impact she's had on people's lives cannot be erased by political discourse. The real question is, why do you focus so much on the noise when the results speak for themselves? Rebecca's carefully curated facade began to crack. She shifted in her seat, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge. I think it's important to consider the full picture, she said defensively, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. And the full picture, Barron countered, includes the thousands of children who have benefited from her initiatives, the partnerships she's built, and the resources she's created for families. If you're truly interested in telling the full story, perhaps that's where your focus should be. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the studio lights. Even the crew, who had maintained a professional detachment throughout the interview, seemed transfixed by the dynamic playing out before them. Rebecca, visibly rattled, forced a tight smile. You make a compelling point, she said, though her tone betrayed her discomfort. Melania seized the moment to steer the conversation toward her current projects. One of my upcoming initiatives focuses on mental health resources for children, particularly in underserved communities, she said. I believe that every child deserves the tools to succeed, regardless of their circumstances. Rebecca nodded stiffly, scribbling notes but clearly deflated. The interview had slipped from her control, and she knew it. Meanwhile, Barron leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but watchful. He had done what he set out to do, protect his mother's integrity and ensure her message was heard. As the interview wrapped up, Rebecca forced a smile and turned to the camera. Mrs. Trump, thank you for your time and for sharing your perspective, she said. And Barron, it's clear your mother has a strong advocate in you. Thank you, Melania said graciously, rising from her seat. Barron gave a polite nod, but remained silent, his work done. As they left the studio, the tension that had filled the air seemed to dissipate. Melania placed a hand on her son's arm, her voice soft but filled with pride. Thank you, Barron, she said. You were wonderful. You didn't need my help, Mom, he replied, his voice steady. But I wasn't going to let anyone distort your story. The following morning, the interview aired across major networks and online platforms, quickly becoming the center of heated discussions. The reactions were polarizing, but one aspect was universally agreed upon. Barron Trump's composure and sharp rebuttals had become the highlight of the exchange. Clips of his comments flooded social media, with hashtags like hashtag defending Melania and hashtag Barron speaks trending globally. In a quiet corner of the Trump residence, Barron scrolled through his phone, observing the whirlwind of opinions. Some praised his poise and maturity, calling him a voice of reason in a world of divisive rhetoric. Others, predictably, criticized him, claiming he was coached or simply parroting his family's stance. He felt no need to respond to the noise, content with knowing he had done what was necessary. Melania joined him, carrying a tray of tea. She placed it on the coffee table and sat beside him, her serene demeanor unshaken by the media storm. "You've become quite the topic of conversation," she said with a gentle smile. Barron shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't do it for attention," he said. "I just wanted them to see you for who you really are, not who they think you are." Melania reached out, placing a hand over his. "And they did. Your words reminded people that our actions matter more than their opinions. I'm proud of you." Meanwhile, Rebecca Blake sat in her office, replaying the interview in her mind. She had underestimated Barron, dismissing him as a silent observer. Now, she faced the consequences of that miscalculation. Her email inbox was flooded, not only with criticism from her audience, but also with questions from her colleagues about her motives and approach. For the first time in her career, Rebecca found herself questioning her own methods. As the days passed, news outlets began shifting their focus. Analysts dissected the interview, pointing out the shift in tone and the power dynamics at play. Barron's eloquence and defense of his mother were celebrated by some as a rare example of grace under pressure. Even those critical of the Trump family begrudgingly admitted that Barron had handled himself with dignity. For Barron, life went on quietly. He resumed his studies and personal projects, avoiding the media spotlight as much as possible. Yet, his words during the interview continued to resonate. They sparked conversations about the role of journalism, the ethics of ambush-style interviews, and the importance of maintaining humanity in public discourse. Melania, too, noticed a shift in how her initiatives were discussed. While criticism remained, there was an increasing acknowledgement of her genuine commitment to children's welfare. The interview, though challenging, had reminded people of her humanity and her efforts to make a difference. Late one evening, as Barron sat by the window reading, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from an old schoolmate he hadn't spoken to in years. "Saw the interview. You did good, man. Respect." Barron smiled faintly, tucking the phone away. He wasn't one for accolades, but the message reminded him that even small actions could ripple outward, touching lives in unexpected ways. In the days following the interview, Rebecca Blake found herself at the center of an unexpected backlash. The sharp questions she had prepared with the intent to challenge Melania Trump were now being scrutinized as overly aggressive, even unfair. Social media was filled with critiques of her approach, and colleagues at the network began to distance themselves, wary of the controversy surrounding her performance. Rebecca spent hours replaying the interview, searching for where she had lost control. Each time Barron's calm voice cut through her carefully laid plans, she winced. She had underestimated him, treating him as a passive bystander rather than the formidable advocate he turned out to be. Worse still, her failure to adjust her strategy in real time had only amplified her perceived bias. One evening, alone in her office, Rebecca opened her email to find a message from her editor. The subject line read, "Let's talk." Her stomach sank as she clicked it open. The message was direct but professional, urging her to take time to reflect on her methods and consider how to rebuild trust with the audience. It was a blow to her pride but also a wake-up call. Meanwhile, Barron had moved on from the media storm, focusing on his studies and family. Yet, the impact of his words continued to ripple. At a community event Melania attended, parents approached her to express their admiration for how her son had handled himself. "You've raised a fine young man," one woman said, her tone warm. "It's not easy to stand up for what's right, especially in the public eye." Melania smiled, her pride evident. "He has always been thoughtful," she replied. "He understands the importance of speaking with conviction, but also with respect." Rebecca, on the other hand, couldn't escape the interview's aftermath. One morning, as she sat sipping her coffee, she stumbled upon an op-ed written by a veteran journalist she deeply respected. The article wasn't just about her. It was about the broader state of journalism. It critiqued the tendency to prioritize sensationalism over substance and urged reporters to return to their roots, telling stories with integrity and fairness. The words struck a chord with Rebecca. For years, she had prided herself on her ability to challenge powerful figures, but somewhere along the way, she had blurred the line between accountability and antagonism. The interview with Melania and Barron had exposed that flaw, forcing her to confront the choices she had made. That evening, she drafted an article of her own. In it, she reflected on the interview, acknowledging her missteps and the lessons she had learned. As journalist, she wrote, "Our role is not to dominate the narrative but to facilitate understanding. In my pursuit of tough questions, I lost sight of the humanity of those I interviewed. For that, I take responsibility." The article was published the next day, and while it garnered mixed reactions, it also sparked important conversations. Some applauded Rebecca's candor, while others remained skeptical of her motives. Regardless, Rebecca felt a sense of catharsis. She had taken the first step toward rebuilding her credibility and, more importantly, her sense of purpose. For Barron and Melania, life returned to normal. Yet the interview had left an indelible mark, not just on their family, but on those who watched. It reminded the world of the power of grace, dignity, and the courage to stand for what is right, even when faced with adversity. Rebecca's article had caused ripples throughout the journalism community. Her candid reflection on the interview and her admission of bias resonated with some and infuriated others. For Rebecca, however, it marked the beginning of a personal and professional transformation. She realized that the walls she had built to shield herself from criticism had also blinded her to the very purpose of her craft: to seek truth, not to dictate it. At the same time, Barron and Melania remained in the public eye, though their focus shifted back to their respective projects. For Barron, the whirlwind surrounding the interview had become a distant hum, though occasional headlines still highlighted his poised defense of his mother. He had gained a newfound respect for the power of words and the weight they carried, particularly in public discourse. One afternoon, Rebecca found herself at a charity luncheon where Melania was scheduled to speak. It was a coincidence. Rebecca had been invited by a colleague, but as she entered the elegant venue, she felt a pang of unease. She hadn't expected to see the former First Lady so soon after the interview. Still, curiosity compelled her to stay. Melania's speech was focused on one of her initiatives: expanding mental health resources for children in underserved communities. She spoke with passion and sincerity, her message resonating with the room. Rebecca found herself listening intently, not as a journalist looking for flaws, but as a person genuinely moved by the cause. For the first time, she saw Melania not as a political figure but as a mother and advocate. After the speech, Rebecca approached Melania hesitantly. "Mrs. Trump," she began, her voice softer than usual, "may I have a moment of your time?" Melania turned to her, her expression calm but curious. "Of course," she said. "I wanted to thank you for your speech," Rebecca said, her tone earnest. "It was inspiring, and I also wanted to apologize for how I handled the interview. I realize now that my approach was unfair, and I hope you'll accept my apology." Melania studied her for a moment before replying. "Thank you for saying that," she said, her voice warm but measured. "We all have room to grow, don't we?" Rebecca nodded, feeling a sense of relief she hadn't expected. "Yes, we do, and I'm working on it." Meanwhile, Barron watched from across the room, having noticed Rebecca's presence. He approached as the conversation concluded, his tall frame and composed demeanor as striking as ever. "Ms. Blake," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Good to see you again." "Barron," Rebecca said, offering a small smile. "I was just telling your mother how much I appreciated her speech." "Glad to hear it," Barron replied, his expression softening slightly. "It's never too late to start seeing things differently." Rebecca nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She had underestimated both of them in the past, but she was determined not to repeat that mistake. As the event continued, Rebecca left with a renewed sense of purpose. The encounter with Melania and Barron had reminded her of the importance of humility, growth, and listening. For their part, Melania and Barron left the event feeling a sense of quiet vindication, not through triumph, but through the power of having stood firm in their principles. As the dust settled from the whirlwind of media attention, Barron and Melania Trump found themselves preparing for another high-profile event, one that would put their ideals, composure, and principles to the ultimate test. A major international conference on youth mental health and advocacy had invited Melania to speak as a keynote guest. The event promised to bring together thought leaders, policymakers, and journalists from around the world. This time, however, the stakes were higher. Rebecca Blake had been assigned to moderate the panel discussion following Melania's keynote speech. The announcement sparked curiosity and speculation among the public. Would Rebecca approach the discussion with renewed integrity, or would she try to regain the edge she had lost in the previous interview? For Barron, the news was a challenge he welcomed. He knew his mother was more than capable of holding her own, but he also prepared himself to step in if necessary. In the days leading up to the conference, Melania immersed herself in her notes, fine-tuning her speech to reflect her ongoing commitment to children's mental health. Barron, ever her silent sentinel, reviewed the event program and researched potential questions that could arise during the panel discussion. Their teamwork was unspoken but seamless, a testament to their shared determination. Meanwhile, Rebecca was undergoing a transformation of her own. Her candid article about the interview and her conversation with Melania at the luncheon had sparked a re-evaluation of her approach to journalism. She spent hours researching the topics the panel would cover, determined to focus on substance rather than spectacle. For Rebecca, the conference was an opportunity not only to rebuild her professional reputation, but also to align her work with the values she once held dear. On the day of the event, the venue buzzed with energy. Delegates filled the grand hall, their conversations a blend of optimism and anticipation. Melania and Barron arrived early, their presence commanding quiet respect. As they made their way to the green room, Melania placed a hand on Barron's arm. "Whatever happens today," she said softly, "remember, we speak from the heart. That's all that matters." Barron nodded, his calm demeanor masking the quiet fire within him. "We'll be fine," he assured her. "We've faced worse." When Melania took the stage, the room fell silent. Her speech was a masterclass in authenticity and advocacy. She spoke about the importance of destigmatizing mental health issues, sharing personal anecdotes and success stories from her initiatives. The audience hung on her every word, their applause thunderous as she concluded. Then came the panel discussion. Rebecca took her place as moderator, her voice steady as she introduced the panelists. When it was Melania's turn to speak, Rebecca asked her questions that were thoughtful and respectful, focusing on solutions rather than controversies. Barron, watching from the front row, observed Rebecca closely. She was different, more composed, more genuine. He saw in her the beginnings of a shift he hadn't expected. As the panel continued, the dialogue between Rebecca and Melania became a highlight of the event. Their exchange, while professional, carried an undercurrent of mutual respect. Rebecca asked challenging but fair questions, and Melania answered with grace and clarity. The audience, captivated by the dynamic, saw in their interaction a symbol of reconciliation and growth. When the panel concluded, the room erupted in applause. Rebecca stood to thank the panelists, her gaze briefly meeting Melania's. There was a flicker of understanding between them, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had both undertaken to reach this moment. As Melania and Barron prepared to leave, Rebecca approached them backstage. "Mrs. Trump," she said, her voice quiet but sincere, "thank you for your insights today. I learned a lot." Melania smiled. "Thank you, Rebecca. Your questions were thoughtful. I'm glad we could have this conversation." Rebecca turned to Barron, her expression softening. "And thank you, Barron, for holding me accountable when I needed it most." Barron offered a small nod, his voice steady. "Accountability is the first step toward change. You've done the work. It shows." As they parted ways, Barron and Melania walked toward the exit, the energy of the event still buzzing around them. For Barron, the day was a victory, not one of dominance, but of dialogue, dignity, and growth. The conference's energy lingered in the air as Barron and Melania Trump prepared to leave. Yet, just as they reached the exit, Rebecca Blake approached again, this time with an unmistakable determination in her eyes. "Barron," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. "Do you have a moment?" Barron glanced at his mother, who gave him a slight nod before continuing toward the car. Turning back to Rebecca, he folded his arms and said, "Sure. What's on your mind?" Rebecca hesitated, but only for a moment. "I've been reflecting a lot since our first encounter," she began. "I thought I understood the role of a journalist, to challenge, to uncover truths. But I realized I was so focused on being tough that I lost sight of fairness and humanity." Barron studied her, his expression unreadable. "That's a big realization," he said after a pause. "What brought it on?" Rebecca smiled faintly, the hint of self-deprecation in her expression. "You did," she admitted. "The way you defended your mother, it wasn't just about loyalty. It was about truth, and it made me question the way I approach my work. For years, I thought being critical was the same as being thorough, but I see now that they're not always the same." Barron tilted his head, his gaze softening slightly. "Growth isn't easy," he said, "but it's worth it. The fact that you're standing here, saying this, shows you're taking steps in the right direction." Encouraged, Rebecca pressed on. "I want to do better, not just as a journalist, but as a person. And part of that is acknowledging the people who challenged me to see things differently. So, thank you." Barron's lips quirked into a faint smile. "You're welcome," he said. "But remember, the real work comes after the apology. It's about what you do next." Rebecca nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. "I know," she said, "and I'm ready." At that moment, Melania reappeared, her serene presence grounding the conversation. Rebecca turned to her, her voice quieter now. "Mrs. Trump, I hope this conference showed a side of your work that people can't ignore. Thank you for giving me another chance to tell your story." Melania's smile was warm but reserved. "Rebecca, everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow. I hope you continue to use your platform for good." As Rebecca watched them leave, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The weight of her ambition had been replaced with a renewed sense of purpose, to tell stories that uplifted, informed, and inspired. Meanwhile, in the car, Barron turned to his mother. "Do you think she'll follow through?" he asked. Melania considered his question carefully. "I hope so," she said. "But whether she does or not, you showed her what integrity looks like. That's all we can do. Set the example." Barron nodded, leaning back in his seat. For the first time since the interview, he felt a sense of closure. The confrontation had evolved into a conversation, one that left both sides better for it. The days following the conference were quieter for Barron and Melania Trump. The intense media scrutiny had begun to subside, replaced by a more balanced discourse about the issues Melania championed and the integrity Barron had demonstrated. For the first time in a long while, the narrative surrounding their family was one of dignity and hope rather than division and controversy. Rebecca Blake's transformation, meanwhile, was making waves in the journalism world. Her approach had shifted visibly, with her latest articles focusing on meaningful, balanced reporting. Her story about the conference was lauded as one of her best, thoughtful, well-researched, and free from the sensationalism that had once defined her style. In interviews, she credited the Trumps for challenging her to rethink her approach, though she avoided painting herself as a victim or a hero. "It's about the stories, not about me," she told one outlet. "That's what I've learned." At home, Barron settled into his routine, finding solace in the normalcy of everyday life. Though he rarely spoke about the events that had unfolded, he couldn't deny the pride he felt in standing by his mother when it mattered most. Melania, too, seemed more at ease. Her speech at the conference had sparked renewed interest in her initiatives, and she received invitations to collaborate with several international organizations. One evening, as the sun set over Manhattan, Melania and Barron sat on their balcony, a quiet moment of respite between them. "You've grown into a remarkable young man," Melania said softly, her gaze fixed on the skyline. Barron smiled faintly. I had a good teacher, he replied. You've always shown me what it means to stay true to yourself, no matter what people say. Melania reached over, placing her hand over his. And you've shown me the strength of speaking up, even when it's difficult. I've always believed in leading with grace, but you've reminded me that sometimes grace means standing firm. Barron nodded, his thoughts drifting to Rebecca. Do you think people can really change? He asked. Melania considered the question carefully. Yes, she said, but only if they truly want to. Change is hard work. It requires humility and courage. Rebecca has taken the first steps, but it's up to her to keep going. I think she will, Barron said after a moment. She seemed genuine. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the city lights twinkling like stars. For Barron, the events of the past weeks had been a lesson in resilience, accountability, and the power of standing for what was right. For Melania, it was a reminder of the importance of her work and the strength of the bond she shared with her son. The world outside continued to spin, its challenges and complexities ever present. But in that moment, on that balcony, there was a sense of peace, a quiet acknowledgement of the battles fought, the lessons learned, and the path forward. If you made it this far, subscribe. See you soon.